Today on Mr. Media, I'll welcome Saul Austerlitz, author of Another Fine Mess, The History of American Film Comedy. Stick around.
Hey, did you know that you can listen to the latest Mr. Media show right on your phone with the Stitcher app? Stitcher's smart radio for your smartphone. Mr. Media is on demand and on the go with Stitcher. Download Stitcher for your phone today. Get the free app at www.stitcher.com. That's STITCHER.com.
So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media interview. You know, MrMedia.com, MRmedia.com. Stop by and check it out. There are more than 600 archived celebrity interviews for your listening pleasure. The show is brought to you today by thepartyauthority.us. Planning a wedding, mitzvah, or corporate event? For any and all occasions, call the Party Authority nationwide at 1-800-DIAL-DJs. That's 1-800-342-5357, where one call does it all. As we like to say, Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of truly dramatically trained actors throwing cream pies at one another in the new media capital of the world and home of the second best team in baseball, St. Petersburg, Florida.
You just mind your P's and Q's, Buster, and remember who you're dealing with.
Bueller. Ferris Bueller.
If it's a choice between watching drama or comedy, I always pick comedy. I mean, why choose to get all weepy and sad when the other option is to fall off your chair laughing? I think the die was cast for me back in 1978 when my friend Steve Golden and I saw Animal House with John Belushi the night it opened at a theater in Princeton, New Jersey. I had seen comedies before, of course, but none that had ever worn me out. We laughed so hard at the antics of the Delta House gang that when we went back the next night, and quite a few more times after that, and of course, eventually, as we got older, bought the video cassettes, got the DVD here, you know. Saul Austerlitz would probably make the same choice, I'm guessing. He's the author of a new book, Another Fine Mess, A History of American Film Comedy. Now, it takes the genre from Charlie Chaplin, whose work I myself studied at the University of Florida many years ago, to Judd Apatow, whose work I now study from the comfort of my family room without the annoyance and interruption of pop quizzes and term papers. Austerlitz established his pop culture research credentials with the previous book, Money for Nothing, A History of the Music Video, From the Beatles to the White Stripes. Saul Austerlitz, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thanks for having me on.
Good to have you here. I'm guessing that this was incredibly stressful research for you. How are you holding up?
Yeah, I can't say it was too difficult, although there were times where I had to sit through the likes of The Love Guru or Austin Powers and Goldmember, and that wasn't always the most pleasant watching experience. But for the most part, I can't really complain about my job.
You knew Love Guru was not going to be in the book. Why did you have to sit through it?
You know, I'm a bit of a completist, so I felt like I had to sit through everything to really round out the perspective. And it did help, though, to know sometimes and psych yourself up, you know, this movie is going to be terrible. And then sometimes you even manage to have a bit of perverse enjoyment from it, having begun from that point of view.
Anything that surprised you that you were expecting to be awful?
Actually, I think the one movie that comes to mind that I had heard was absolutely nightmarishly terrible and that I ended up liking to some extent was the Eddie Murphy movie Norbit, which I don't think too many people saw. It's sort of like a Nutty Professor remake where Eddie Murphy plays a variety of kind of unpleasant characters, including this very rude, unpleasant, overweight woman. And I kept finding myself being surprised at how much I was chuckling at the movie. It's totally politically incorrect and kind of offensive, but it's also really, really funny. And I was amused to see how much I ended up liking it.
Isn't offensive and totally politically incorrect the perfect comedy?
To To some extent, yeah. I think Eddie Murphy is definitely has sort of taken on that role in particular of just kind of crafting these absurdist stereotypes and then running with them. And Norbit, I think, is a good example of that.
I just saw about a week ago a movie. It was Eddie Murphy and Steve Martin, and I had put it off, and finally I was going to take a nap, and I like to put the TV on if I do that, and it was on, and I can't. You probably know the title. I can't think of it off the top of my head. Bowfinger, and I was surprised. It actually made me delay my nap because it was actually pretty funny.
Yeah, I think Steve Martin wrote that movie, and he's obviously a very clever guy. It's a pretty impressive satire of Hollywood, and what I thought was most surprising was Eddie Murphy being so game to poke fun at himself and his own proclivities. And in some ways, that's what I found the most surprising in general, was how much better I liked Eddie Murphy's post-1980s work than I had expected to. I really hadn't seen all that much of it when it had first come around, but movies like Bowfinger or The Nutty Professor or even Norbit, I found to be pretty entertaining.
While we're talking about Eddie, what about Dave?
That one I have to admit that I skipped.
Wait a minute. You sat through The Love Guru knowing that it was probably one of the worst movies ever made, but you skipped Dave?
Yeah, I somehow have always missed that movie. I don't know. I know that's one of those ones that's like embarrassing to admit, so eventually I have to catch up to it, but I haven't seen it.
Now, one of the things I thought was interesting, and we'll get to the selection in a minute, but the book is basically two parts. It's the longer entries, Steve Martin, Charlie Chaplin, Judd Apatow, Eddie Murphy make the longer entries. I was kind of surprised that Robin Williams only made a short entry, and at that, it sounded like you had some regrets about having him in the book at all.
Yeah, Robin Williams and Billy Crystal, for me, were sort of birds of a feather. I like them both. It's not that I have anything particularly bad to say about either of them, but looking over their actual filmography, I was sort of surprised to see how thin they both were. With Robin Williams, he's obviously a great comedian, and I think that a lot of his reputation is burnished by his stand-up. But in terms of the actual roles he played, I couldn't really think of anything that was all that impressive to me, that really stuck out in my mind. Some of his dramatic work, I think, is good. I liked him in Good Will Hunting. But in terms of the comedies he made, it just felt to me like there was less there than met the eye. It's not that I dislike Robin Williams. It's just that I didn't think there was quite so much there.
Is part of the problem for someone like Robin that he's done too much work? For every Patch Adams, there's an RV. I mean, it's just there's a lot of work.
There is,
but it's not necessarily great work.
Right. I think that he really damaged his reputation with a lot of the mediocre and even worse than mediocre movies he made in the late 90s and early years of last decade. It's hard to overcome the likes of Patch Adams and Death to Smoochie and Bicentennial Man and various other box office duds that they made. And I think that has kind of, I don't think he's ever entirely recovered from the critical drubbing that those movies took.
Now, I have to say in his defense, I like you, I like the guy a lot. My daughter, who's a teen, just absolutely loved a movie that I can't bring myself to sit through, RV with Robin Williams and Cheryl Hines, I think, and also this one I agree with her on. I thought Jumanji, which is kind of a dramedy, kind of a comedy drama, very good Robin Williams movie if people haven't seen it.
Yeah, I think also, and this is true in general for writing about comedy, it's so subjective and it's so difficult to convince someone else that someone who they don't think is funny, and vice versa. It's very hard for me to make a completely objective argument about someone like, say, Adam Sandler, who I just happen to not like at all. Other people think he's the bee's knees, the absolute funniest guy in the whole world, and I think he's terrible, but, we're not really going to convince each other. So to me, that's one of the interesting aspects of writing about comedy, is just how unbelievably subjective the whole experience is. If you laugh, it's funny. If you don't laugh, it's not funny. And I think there's a lot more to be said beyond that, but the prospect of trying to convince someone to give someone they don't like a second chance is a daunting one.
How many movies did you actually watch for this book?
I guesstimated it at about 600.
Over what period of time?
In about a year. Yeah.
Wow.
It was an intense year of movie watching. Now, that being said, I do have to admit that some of them are older movies, so they were, pretty short. Some of the movies I watched were 10 or 20 minutes long, but for the most part, we're talking about feature-length films.
Was there were there any threads between the filmmakers or generations that you found after seeing that many movies that you maybe didn't expect to discover?
Absolutely. I had the ghost of a notion that I was hoping to pursue, and I found it to really be the case after having done the research that I did, which was that, comedy really gets short shrift from the Hollywood establishment and from film fans in general. It's sort of treated as the ugly duckling of genres and something that's not really meant to be taken all that seriously or treated with much respect. But my suspicion had always been that there was this notion of an American comedic tradition that these great performers really spoke to each other, that they were aware of each other's work, that they reflected on each other's work, that they were inspired by each other. And I really ended up finding that to be the case, both within the works themselves, inside the films, you can see ways in which people are paying homage to each other. And also in terms of their lives, you really get the sense that comedy is like a private society of sorts in which these comedians are sort of sharing this incredibly impressive tradition, even if it doesn't necessarily get the respect that it deserves from everyone else. It's clear that the performers that I'm writing about in this book treat comedy with a deep respect and treat other comedians with a deep respect. And that, I thought, was one of the most interesting things that came out of this project for me.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast this week. It's called, pardon my French, but the podcast is called What the Fuck with Mark Maron, who's a stand-up comedian, and he interviewed Judd Apatow. And they talked about they talked about a lot of things. It's a great thing, and I encourage people to seek it out. But one of the things they talked about was Apatow was saying that he doesn't even like to mention that he's in the same business as Woody Allen, because he says he would watch Allen's movies and just feel like, oh my God, I'm not in that business. But and this is the point I want to make. He also said that with Allen's personal issues over the years, and he said after reading Mia Farrow's book, he really kind of set him aside and just doesn't want to deal with him anymore. He just doesn't see him the same way. And I was thinking about that, knowing we were going to talk, and I wondered if any of the actors or filmmakers that you include in the book, whether the long or short version, if any of their positions was affected by, what's going on in their personal lives.
Yeah, I definitely think that Woody Allen is a really good example of that. I think it's very difficult to deal with his work without engaging with his personal life, as messy and bizarre and just kind of unpleasant as it is. I think that also when you look at Woody Allen's work in particular, you see the evidence of, just the nasty fallout of the whole Mia Soon-Yi situation in his work. After after he and Mia Farrow break it off and he ends up marrying Soon-Yi, you really see that reflected in the kinds of films he makes, which are often reflecting on the moral prerogatives of the artist. You know, there are all of these artist figures in his movies from the late 90s and onward who are sort of amoral. You know, I'm thinking of someone like the Chaz Palminteri character in Bullets Over Broadway, who's this, you know, murderous gangster, but also a brilliant playwright in a way that the kind of polished, high society character played by John Cusack could never be. And I think in some ways that's Woody Allen, you know, writing a stand-in for himself, you know, someone who's kind of above the law in some ways. So, yeah, I think that he's wrestling with it even inside his own work as well. But it's interesting as well that you bring up the Judd Apatow thing, because I think one of the reasons why I thought that Apatow would be a great way to kind of end the book, you know, being the last chapter of the main portion of the book, was that in addition to being kind of the I think, one of the most impressive comic figures of the present moment, he's also someone who's really deeply reflected on the comedic tradition. He's someone who's very aware of it. You know, when Judd Apatow was in high school on Long Island, he had a radio show where he ended up bringing on a lot of the great comedians of the time, people like, you know, Jay Leno and I think Steve Martin. You know, he had these contacts because his mom was a booker at a stand-up club. And so even as a kid, Judd Apatow is already kind of immersed in this comic tradition. And you can see it in his work as well, that he's really deeply conscious of what's come before him. And his movies, I think, really blaze new ground, but at the same time, he's someone who's very aware of the kind of rich heritage that he's working in.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just take a quick 20-second break. This is Bob Andelman, and you're listening to the Mr. Media radio interview with Saul Austerlitz, author of Another Fine Mess, A History of American Film Comedy. And we'll be right back.
Ever thought of hosting your own radio show? Now you can by registering at blogtalkradio.com. While you're there, check out our selection of premium packages. To start your own show today, visit blogtalkradio.com.
Now, this is the amazing Kreskin. If you could read my thoughts, you'd know you're listening to Mr. Media Radio.
Yeah, and this is Bob Andelman, and you are listening to the Mr. Media Radio interview with Saul Austerlitz, author of Another Fine Mess, A History of American Film Comedy. Saul, what, now you sound on, you know, in this interview, you sound like a rather subdued fellow, but what makes you laugh every time? What filmmaker, what actor, what'll always crack you up?
I have to say that I have a real weakness for Will Ferrell. He's one of those performers who, when he just appears on the screen, I'm already laughing to myself. It's hard for me to put my finger on exactly what it is about him, but he's so gloriously goofy, and he has such a knack for these kind of absurdist explosions of you know, of words that don't really fit, that don't really make any sense, that just kind of pop out of him at times, that I just inevitably find him incredibly funny.
Now, that would be more the Will Ferrell Elf than maybe Will Ferrell Night at the Roxbury, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I would say more the Will Ferrell of, say, Anchorman or Old School than even Elf.
Do you laugh when he has his clothes off?
Definitely.
And speaking of Will Ferrell, let's make the connection. What about the whole genre of Saturday Night Live films? Where does Lorne Michael, the TV producer, fit in as Lorne Michael, the film producer? Does he have any place at all in a book on American film comedy?
I think he does. You know, I think that his track record is a bit mixed, to be honest. You know, I think obviously as a television producer and television figure, he's unmatched. In terms of his film track record, it's not quite as impressive. I think to some extent, the impression that I get from having read Live from New York, which is a terrific oral history of Saturday Night Live by Tom Shales. Lorne Michaels is sort of like the father figure for a lot of the SNL cast members and alumni, and I think that a lot of them, after they've served their time at home, kind of want to move out of the house and not come back. They don't necessarily want to work with Dad again. So I think that that's contributed to some extent to the fact that a lot of his movies have not really been quite up to the SNL level. But I still think that he's done a lot of good work, and I think that there have been a pretty decent number of good SNL comedies that have come out. I mean, I think that Wayne's World is probably the best example of what a Saturday Night Live movie can be, and there are definitely a bunch that are significantly more mediocre. But I think there have been...
It's Pat.
Exactly. I mean, in the 90s, they really kind of overdid it. There were so many spin-offs of SNL sketches into movies, and a lot of them were really thin and just not well thought out. And I think that hurt their brand to some extent. But even MacGruber, which came out earlier this year, I thought was not bad. And, I think I wouldn't be surprised to see some more SNL sketch films in the future.
Now, in the second part of the book, as I mentioned, you have a series of shorter entries. I was kind of surprised to see Abbott and Costello didn't rank a full entry. They're the first ones in the short section.
Right. Again, it's so subjective, and I know that a lot of people love Abbott and Costello the same way that people love the Three Stooges, and to me, Abbott and Costello just didn't quite do it for me, especially after having watched so much of Laurel and Hardy's work. They really felt for me like kind of a pale imitation of the real thing.
But now I have to ask you, further back in that section, they're in a section with Renee Zellweger. Renee Zellweger rates in this book. I had a problem with that one.
With Renee Zellweger in particular?
Yeah, I just thought, okay, not a name I think of. If I'm going to laugh at names, okay, Zellweger's pretty funny, but in terms of her comedy portfolio, I don't know. I thought that was kind of an odd one.
Well, for me, it was the issue was partially that I wanted to broaden the definition of what comedy was to some extent, so that it wasn't just people who had emerged from stand-up or vaudeville or some, completely comedic tradition. I wanted to make sure to include things that were comic in a slightly different sense, which is why you see something like Pixar included in the book. And in terms of Renee Zellweger, I thought that it was valuable to include some of the performers who had, I thought, been quite funny in kind of films more oriented towards women, because I think that a lot of today's comedies are really aggressively marketed for men. Even work like Judd Apatow's and Will Ferrell's, which I really like and really admire, I think that they're really guys' movies to some extent. And I wanted to also reflect on people like Renee Zellweger or people like Julia Roberts, who are, I think, comedic performers, although obviously in a different way than someone like Will Ferrell is, and I think do have something to contribute to the discussion. The other interesting thing for me about Renee Zellweger in particular is that in the book I have a chapter on Doris Day, who I think is a very underrated comic performer and whose movies are really ripe for reevaluation. And a couple of years ago, Renee Zellweger and Ewan McGregor made a film called Down with Love, which I thought was terrific, which is basically a tribute and parody to the old Rock Hudson, Doris Day movies like Pillow Talk. And so in some ways, again, reflecting on this idea of a comic tradition and of this kind of hall of mirrors in which the past is reflected in the present, I thought it was interesting to include Renee Zellweger as sort of the modern-day incarnation of Doris Day.
You also have the incredibly funny Alfred Hitchcock in the short entries, and you cite him for North by Northwest and To Catch a Thief. Okay, I got to ask. Defend Alfred Hitchcock in a comedy book.
Well, again, like what I'm saying, I wanted to broaden the definition of comedy. So, I totally understand you're asking about Alfred Hitchcock. I sort of thought that if you were to ask about anything, it would be John Wayne, who no one thinks of as funny at all. But the thing about Hitchcock and about Wayne is that, especially in the 40s and 50s in Hollywood, the sort of the lines between genres weren't as carefully drawn as they are today. So someone like Hitchcock, who's obviously associated with suspense, or someone like John Wayne, who's associated with war films and westerns, there still were comedic elements in their work. Hitchcock can be very funny at times when that's what he's aiming to do in movies that are, I think, more like caper films, like North by Northwest or To Catch a Thief, than more serious work like Vertigo. And John Wayne also, in movies that he made in the 50s with John Ford, like The Quiet Man, shows a real talent for being funny and for sort of engaging in lighter-hearted material than you normally associate him with. So I wanted to make sure to include figures like those, not because they're necessarily all-out comedians, but rather because I wanted to indicate that comedy kind of bled into the landscape at large of Hollywood earlier on.
Saul, I guess we're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but if you look at today's crop of comedic actors or filmmakers, who might be in the back of the book now in the shorter section and might move up, and who might come to the book altogether new? I'm guessing that someone who might move from the back of the book to the front of the book, if you got to do another edition down the line, maybe someone like Tina Fey. But I was wondering who you were thinking.
That's actually exactly who I was thinking of. And in the short entry that I write about Tina Fey, I basically indicate that she doesn't necessarily have the track record as of yet to really merit belonging. But my suspicion is that when we check back in 10 years, she will have more than stated her case. I think that she's really an outlandishly talented performer. She's someone who can act, she's someone who can write, and she just, I think, is in some ways the counterweight to the sort of guys' comedy of people like Apatow and Will Ferrell. And I'm very curious to see what she ends up doing, what direction she takes her work in. But I think that she's one of the most gifted comedians out there, and I definitely think that if and when there is another edition, she'll likely merit a lot more discussion.
All right. Well, folks, listen, you can find Another Fine Mess, A History of American Film Comedy, written by Saul Austerlitz, in great bookstores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price on MrMedia.com. And Saul, can people find you online? Is there a website, Twitter, Facebook, any of that stuff?
Absolutely. I have a website at saulausterlitz.com, and you can also find me on Facebook and on Twitter at AFMess.
Saul, a fascinating subject. I love talking comedy, and thank you for joining us on Mr. Media today.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. And folks, for more original interviews with America's top filmmakers and actors, you can surf over to our main website, MrMedia.com, MRmedia.com. And please take advantage of this great offer from Mr. Media radio listeners. You can go to audiblepodcast.com/MRmedia for a free audiobook of your choice when you sign up today. Again, that's audiblepodcast.com/MRmedia for your free audiobook. Subscribe to Mr. Media on iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Just search Mr. Media Interview from within iTunes and subscribe for free. And while you're there, you could give us a couple of stars, write a little review, help a brother out. You can also listen to the show, of course, with a piece of string and a tin can in many locations. If you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@mrmedia.com. You can also follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, twitter.com/Andelman, or on Facebook, just search Mr. Media Interview. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you sharing a piece of your day with Mr. Media. Thanks for listening.